Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Bridget Boyle and I'm the technical assistant for the Living New Deal. So I'm just going to give you a quick little overview of how this is going to go and then we'll get started. So if you are watching on Facebook, welcome. And if you are in the Zoom webinar, there is a Q&A feature where you can put any questions that you have. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a Q&A button. You can click on that and enter your questions. And when it comes down to the Q&A time at the end of the webinar, we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. And in the meantime, I think we're ready to get started. And Susan, if I missed anything, please feel free to ask me.
Thanks, Bridget. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining tonight's webinar, The Rise and Fall and Rebirth of the Federal Writers Project, hosted by the Living New Deal. I'm Susan Ives. I'm part of a team at the Living New Deal, a nonprofit popularizing the idea of a new Deal by educating the public about the New Deal's pivotal role during a time of national crisis. The Living New Deal was founded at UC Berkeley about a dozen years ago. It has grown to become a nationwide organization. Our team stretches from the West Coast to the East Coast with volunteer researchers and associates in many states in between. The Living New Deal maintains a growing website. We are working to document all that the New Deal built, from post offices to parks, from schools to sidewalks to city halls. Our mission is to preserve the New Deal's legacy, make people aware of what the New Deal was and did, and promote the New Deal as a model for a New Deal today. This webinar series, called The Next New Deal, is part of that effort. Next month, we'll be featuring Eric Rauchway, author of Why the New Deal Matters. In October, we'll be hearing from Neil Maher, author of Nature's New Deal, about the Civilian Conservation Corps and its possible reincarnation as the Civilian Climate Corps. Joining us from New Jersey tonight is Scott Borchert. Scott is the author of Republic of Detours, How the New Deal Paid Broke Writers to Rediscover America, a book about the WPA Federal Writers Project. The book has received glorious reviews, including from The Atlantic, The New York Times, NPR, and more, and is a nominee for the Living New Deal's New Deal Book Award for 2021. And by the way, we're still accepting nominations for the New Deal Book Award until November 15th. Nonfiction books about the New Deal published this year are eligible. Check out livingnewdeal.org for details. Interviewing Scott tonight from Los Angeles, California, is David Kipen. David was book editor for the San Francisco Chronicle and director of literature for the National Endowment for the Arts before joining writing programs at UCLA. He runs a neighborhood lending library in Boyle Heights called Libros Schmibros. He is also a major force behind legislation for a 21st century Federal Writers Project that is now wending its way through Congress. We appreciate them being with us tonight, and we appreciate you, our audience, for your interest in the New Deal, and invite your donations to the Living New Deal to support this work. And now on to what promises to be a very timely and cool conversation with Scott and David. Thanks.
All right, hi everyone. Welcome. I just wanted to say thank you again to everyone from the Living New Deal for having me tonight, and for David especially for speaking with me. I think it'll be a great conversation. And also for everyone who's tuning in, thanks for watching. So real quickly, I'm the author of a new book about the Federal Writers Project called Republic of Detours. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the project, just give you the basic background on it and what I tried to do in the book. I have a really brief slideshow, which we'll move through quickly. So we can start the slides. I can get moving on that. All right, here we go. So what I tried to do in the book, to tell the story of the Federal Writers Project, I tried to kind of take these deep dives into the experiences of a handful of individual people to kind of show like what they did, what brought them to work with the project or be associated with it, what their lives were like during the Depression, and what kind of backgrounds they came from, and then what they did with the project when they were there. So I'm going to just give a little taste of that through this slideshow without getting into too much detail. Here we have Harry Hopkins. Obviously, I think most people watching tonight probably know who he was. The Roosevelt administration's relief czar. He was the head of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, and the other relief agencies before that. And I think if you want to understand where the Federal Writers Project came from, you have to understand this idea that Hopkins and other people in the Roosevelt administration thought was very important, is that if you were going to create jobs for people during the Depression, obviously you had millions of people out of work who needed jobs, who had nothing else, and the federal government had to step in and do something. If you were creating jobs for them, it didn't just have to be in construction and engineering and the kind of like heavy traditional public works that had sometimes existed in the past. They thought it was very important to try to involve white collar workers, professional workers, and workers in the arts into create programs that were kind of tailored for them. And there's a little of this in the other relief organizations before the WPA, but the WPA really made it part of the whole architecture of how it addressed the jobless in the Depression. So you had this section called Federal Project Number 1, and this housed the Federal Writers Project, and then similar projects for the visual arts, music, and theater. And then later something called the Historical Record Survey, which transcribed records in different archives and that sort of thing. So Hopkins thought this is really crucial. He has this really famous line where he was giving a press conference right before the WPA was created, and people asked them, or giving him a lot of grief about creating jobs for researchers and that sort of thing, other white collar workers. And he said, hell, they've got to eat too. And that was, his line on it. He wouldn't take any criticism, and he thought this was crucial to their vision of what the New Deal was supposed to do. So when they created the Federal Writers Project, obviously they needed someone to run it, and that person who ran it for the first part of the project's life was Henry Alsberg, who's here on the right. He had this really remarkable life. He was a journalist and aid worker. He worked in the downtown theater scene in New York City. He did all sorts of things, but he never really landed in a very comfortable career for himself. He never achieved this kind of major work that I think he wanted to do as a literary person until he was at the helm of the Federal Writers Project. And, that gave him the chance to really realize that he had this huge amount of, labor power, creative labor power at his command, that he could use this thing to do more than just provide jobs for people who needed the jobs, which is obviously what Hopkins wanted and what was so crucial, but to also use it to create something of lasting value. So he really was the kind of creative visionary of the Federal Writers Project. And I think the way it all played out had a lot to do with him and what he thought the project was capable of doing. I should just mention, I tell his story in my book a little bit. There's this really great biography of him by Susan Damasi that came out a few years ago. It's well worth reading for his whole life story, which is really remarkable. Next slide. Sorry, next slide. There we go. So just really quickly, the way the project was set up, you had a headquarters in Washington, D.C., and this is a picture of Alsberg and one of his editors, Catherine Kellogg, who's there with him in Washington. And then you had all these state offices around the country. So you'd say there was like a Massachusetts Writers Project, a California Writers Project. And these offices were typically set up in the biggest city in each state. And then there are satellite offices spread around the rest of the state. So you really had this thing where it was being directed from Washington, D.C. by Alsberg and his deputies. But it was reaching into every corner of the country. Every county had federal writers going out, surveying the land, going into their communities and writing up what they saw. We'll get into the plan of what they're doing later, but it had this kind of national scope that was completely unprecedented. And you can see in the other picture, that's the second home of the Writers Project in Washington, which was the McLean Mansion. It was this really gaudy, huge mansion that was owned by a Washington, D.C. socialite who fell on hard times and had to lease it to the federal government. So the Writers Project took it over. Next slide. And here, I'm just going to talk about very briefly some of the people who worked for the project. We have Zora Neale Hurston on the left and Vardis Fisher on the right. These are two people who are not really discussed together in any way. I don't know if they knew each other or were aware of each other's work. It's possible. But when they joined the Federal Writers Project, they were both pretty well-established writers. They published several books each. Zora Neale Hurston had studied with Franz Boas, the groundbreaking anthropologist at Columbia. Vardis Fisher had a PhD in literature from the University of Chicago. He published a few novels that got a lot of great critical acclaim. Both of them were really at the peak of their careers in some ways, but when the Depression came, they needed something to help them get by. So the Writers Project was designed for people like them who were these accomplished writers and can contribute something to the project, but had nowhere else to go really. And so the way they both experienced it kind of played out in different ways. Both of them had these sort of idiosyncratic politics that kind of shaped their experiences on the project, you could say. Both of them kind of moved to the right as they got older, especially the years after the project, which changed how they remembered it, I think. But, it played a huge role in their lives and it really kept them afloat during the Depression. Next slide. And here we have Nelson Algren and Richard Wright, two other pretty well-known writers. And for me, they're sort of emblematic of another category of writer who worked for the Federal Writers Project. And these are the people who were the up and coming writers who really didn't really have too much to their credit yet, but they had these great aspirations to be novelists or poets or, reporters of that sort of thing. And a lot of them were radicalized during the Depression. Like Wright was a member of the Communist Party. Algren was absolutely in the orbit of the party. They met each other at the John Reed Club in Chicago, which was a organization formed by the Communist Party for artists and writers to get together and talk about their art and their work and the politics of the day and the revolutionary movement, even if it had this kind of loose relationship with the party. So they came out of that atmosphere, and it kind of put them on this path toward being writers. But then the Federal Writers Project actually gave them the almost like professional training that kind of set them on a different path. Like for instance, Richard Wright. I tell this story in the book a little bit, but his career is basically launched by the WPA. He won a contest for stories that he wrote that was open to different federal writers, and that was his first big break, basically. And then when he was working in New York, he wrote the first draft of Native Son while he was working on the creative unit of the New York City project, which was kind of a special, somewhat clandestine sort of thing that they had going in Manhattan. So it really made his career, and Nelson Algren benefited from it too in a very big way. But they weren't like Zora Neale Hurston and Vardis Fisher in the sense that they already had these reputations when they went onto the project. They were practically unknown, but then the project changed that. Next slide. So before I explain this one, there's a third category of writer, and that of course were the people who weren't actually writers. They were clerks, lawyers, teachers, all kinds of people, recent college graduates, people who really had no plan to ever write something in the sense of wanting to get a book published or something like that. But were capable of carrying out the tasks of the Writers Project. And they're really the ones who needed these jobs the most. And a lot of critics of the project, held this against it. They thought that, you're hiring people from all walks of life who aren't really writers and are just collecting these paychecks, and how could you do that? But I would argue that this really kind of gave the Federal Writers Project the ability to reach into all corners of the country, to involve all these different people from different walks of life, and kind of set them to work at creating this vast collective self-portrait of the country, which had never been done before, and which needed to involve just regular, ordinary people who could do the writing and could research and edit and that sort of thing, but weren't necessarily famous novelists or poets or on their way to becoming writers of that kind of renown. So that's really the contribution of the project that made it so astounding, and this kind of great democratic experiment that we're still talking about today and hoping to emulate possibly. So in this picture here, this is from a book called Idaho Lore, which is this great collection of folklore that was created in Idaho under Vardis Fisher's direction. And you can see in here, this is like federal writers at work, basically. There's a woman at the desk here. She's the federal writer speaking to some people there, interviewing them. And it shows you the different methods that they use to collect information, to work on the guidebooks, which is their big project, and then all these other things that the Federal Writers Project ended up doing. You can see at the top, it looks like they're going through like a trunk in someone's attic, and in the middle part, they're in a library going through the books, and the last one, they're going through the clippings in a newspaper. So they used everything. They went out in the field, they talked to people, they did traditional kinds of research, they dug around in attics like that, and in courthouse archives, that sort of thing. Everything was fair game for the Federal Writers Project, and they used it, to great effect in these guidebooks. Next slide. So these will just move through really quickly. I wanted to show you some of these guidebooks. They weren't traditional guidebooks in the sense of showing you how to get from point A to point B. They are these kind of sprawling, unwieldy, surprising, occasionally funny, sometimes bewildering books. This is the New Jersey guide, my home state. You can see it's quite thick. It had 3 sections. There were essays in the first part, a middle section of like profiles of towns and cities, and then this last section of tours. And that's where a lot of the really kind of funky stuff gets in there. But they make for great reading. Like you could sit down with most of them and just read it cover to cover. You don't necessarily have to be out driving around trying to figure out where to go. They worked that way too, or they did a little better in the 1930s. But they're just great pieces of literature. They're astounding. And you can see they're very handsome books. Like here are 2 examples right here. Next slide. Look at a couple more. The New York Guide and the Idaho Guide. They're all a little different because they were published by different publishers. Commercial publishers, mostly like Viking Random House, places that are still around today, university presses, and some of the smaller books that came out were published by local printers, that sort of thing. Next slide. You have Louisiana and Wyoming. Next slide. And then these two I just wanted to mention because on the Tennessee guide there, that's a picture of the Norris Dam, which was kind of the, the keystone of the Tennessee Valley Authority, another, famous New Deal project. And then on the Pennsylvania guide, you had, it's a mural from a post office in Pittsburgh, I believe, which was created by the Treasury Department. They had a section for fine arts, which was sort of a companion operation to the federal art project. It worked a little differently, but they did a lot of these murals that were all in all these post offices, and a lot of them still exist today. So you can see the guides are kind of picking up on these other New Deal efforts. And you can see this throughout the guidebooks, woven into the writing. There are these references to what the WPA and the New Deal in general was doing around the country to transform it. So there's a lot of that kind of like synthesis going on, just really pretty interesting. All right, next slide. And these are some photos from inside the guidebooks to show you, like I said before, these guidebooks are really kind of like a collective self-portrait of the country. And you get that sense from reading them, but you can also get it from looking at photos that are in there and the kind of people they included going around this way, clockwise, I guess. That's a man who was a faith healer in Kentucky. In Oklahoma, you had Native American artists who are at work there. In the one on the bottom right, that's actually a WPA literacy class. They had those all over the country. One of the great things that WPA did that I think a lot of people don't realize anymore today is they carried out these literacy classes and other kinds of adult education classes. And the woman on the right there who's reading is a former slave. And that's another aspect of the Federal Writers Project. So kind of most famously today, they collected these narratives from formerly enslaved people who lived, throughout the South mostly and were still alive. There are several tens of thousands, I think, in the 1930s who were quite elderly, but they were still alive. And so it was the last chance to take down their stories and their memories and preserve them for future generations, is what the Federal Writers Project did. And then the last slide, or the last picture there, is a Tipico orchestra from Texas, which was also run by the WPA. So that was an official federal musical ensemble, which another thing people don't really realize, but this is all in the guidebooks and they're kind of showing all this. Next slide. A couple other photos here. One thing the guides do is pay attention to how people worked. That was a major preoccupation of the people who ran the project, like Alsberg and Catherine Kellogg and some of the other editors there. So they showed how people were living in the 1930s, the kind of work that they did, what their lives were like, which, was pretty remarkable in the sense that these official government publications were paying attention to the lives of working people and showing, what it was like to be, far from the levers of power the way that these people were. So it kind of fit with the whole ethos of the New Deal, I think. Next slide. I mean, these are just some illustrations that are scattered throughout the guidebooks. There are a lot of these. They're great. I just put them in there because I like them mostly, but they were created by the Federal Art Project. Most of the, illustrated pieces of artwork that are in the guidebooks were by the Art Project. So there was, again, some synthesis there between the different parts of Federal Project number 1. Next slide. Yeah, and these are some posters advertising other Federal Writers Project books. They did not only make guidebooks, but they did these are like natural history books. They had they collected the narratives of formerly enslaved people, like I mentioned. They collected life histories of all sorts of people throughout the country, folklore, children's books. They did radio scripts, school bulletins, all kinds of things that didn't necessarily see the light of day when the project still existed, but are in the archives, and people have been mining and in some cases publishing for during later generations. So it's been contributing to the richness of American culture ever since the project was first created, and it continues to today. Next slide. And this is just what a set of guidebooks look like. That's my set, and I tell the story in the book a little bit. I got these from a great uncle of mine who was a book collector. He was a little bit of an eccentric guy, but he collected this massive WPA collection, and I ended up with the state guidebooks actually behind me. You can see over here. So that really sparked my interest in this project, and it got me thinking, like, where did these come from? How did the federal government end up creating these guidebooks? How did all these well-known writers like Zora Neale Hurston, Ralph Ellison, John Cheever, people like that get involved with the Federal Writers Project? And it really is a remarkable story, and it's something we can not only learn from today, but I think try to recreate, as we're going to talk about tonight. Next slide. And so, and we'll get into this in a little more detail, but the project ran up against criticism and against cutbacks from the WPA. They're constantly changing the roles, and you had people in the media and in Congress especially who didn't like the idea of the work relief at all, especially work relief for artists and other cultural workers. This is from this great pamphlet. There are different cartoons kind of showing what the WPA was up against. You have an artist with Uncle Sam down there, while these supposed to be rich fat cats are rolling a boulder off the cliff to destroy it. And that is essentially what happened. Next slide. So this is Martin Dies, Democratic congressman from Texas. He was sort of the agent of that destruction, or one of the people involved in the destruction of the Federal Writers Project and the rest of the cultural apparatus of the New Deal. Not because he necessarily had anything against the idea of cultural work relief, at least in the beginning, I think, but because he had serious problems with the whole scope of the New Deal. He was one of the more conservative members of the Democratic Party who didn't want to go along with what they thought was a too radical effort to remake the economy and to change the relationship of the federal government and citizens. And he also was a very staunch nativist, anti-socialist, fierce anti-communist. So he saw a lot about the Federal Writers Project that he didn't like. And so he kind of put it in his crosshairs when he formed a committee in Congress to investigate subversive activities. It was actually the first iteration of the House Un-American Activities Committee. And they really, barreled down on the Federal Writers Project and the Federal Theater Project in particular. They had these really atrocious hearings. Henry Allisberg was called in to defend the project, and that's in the next slide, actually, which you can go to. Basically, it led to the unraveling of the project in 1939. The Federal Theater Project was abolished completely. The Writers Project hung on, but it was kind of broken down on a state-by-state basis, and it never quite achieved what it had achieved during the first couple of years when it was under Allisberg's direction as this really strong national project. But it still got the rest of the guidebooks out, and it did a lot of other things. It had a lot of great projects that were in the works until they were all cut off in about 1943, when the whole WPA was sort of subsumed into the war effort. So that's the story of what happened to the Federal Writers Project. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the end, as we can talk about tonight. It's a really fantastic story. One of the more kind of unusual, I think, aspects of the New Deal and its contribution. But yeah, we'll get into that a little more. So I think that's the last slide. We can go to the next one or start the conversation.
Hi, Scott.
Hey, David, how are you?
I'm okay. How are you?
I'm good.
That was terrific. I learn something new every time I listen to you, and that's not because I don't try to learn everything possible about the FWP. Welcome to everybody out there, especially those of you to whom the WPA and especially the FWP may come as something of a revelation. I dare say a lot of you do know a little bit about one or the other or both, which is kind of a luxury for us to talk to each other in front of a crowd of co-religionists. So I've got a question that relates to the FWP in the context of the whole WPA. How did the two interact, get along? Could one read in a WPA guide about all the wonderful bridges and roads and murals that were going up as a result of the larger project and the WPA? You tell us.
That's a good question. So initially, there was something different called the Reporting Project, which was based in New York, and that was designed to be kind of the WPA's publicity. They had their own publicity apparatus, but kind of like the Federal Writers Project adjacent operation that would cover what the WPA was doing and write about it and tell the country about what was going on. And that kind of folded pretty early on. And then what I think happened was that the Federal Writers Project figured out that they needed to sort of address what was happening, what the WPA was doing around the country, but they were a little worried about being seen as like boosters. That was something that was kind of the bugbear that they were always afraid of. They didn't want local guides to be, boosterish about their town that was ascribing or something like that. And they didn't want to necessarily be seen as, just serving up propaganda for the Roosevelt administration, which is what a lot of critics accused them of doing, or at least were suspicious that they would be doing when the project was created. And so what happened is that you have these guidebooks that are telling you about, what it's like in the United States, what you see if you travel around different areas. And they start to notice all these little references to the WPA. Like if you go down this road, I forget if it's in Utah or Montana, but there's, dinosaur monument where WPA workers are cleaning off the dinosaur bones and that sort of thing. And if you go somewhere else, there's a civilian conservation corps crew that's doing work over here on soil erosion. So all these things are kind of mixed into the guidebooks, but in a very subtle way. There's also this great book. I have a copy here. These Are Our Lives. This was the only book. This is a later edition. It's not an original edition, but this is the only book that was published during the lifetime of the project that had these life histories that they were collecting, mostly in the South, but really all over the place to kind of feed into the guidebooks. And this book has a section, 60 narratives of people telling about their lives and their aspirations and what they do, what they think. It's kind of like an early version of oral history before that was really created as a true, like, solid academic discipline. So in this guidebook, or in this book, I should say, These Are Our Lives, they have this section about the WPA and the other New Deal programs. So you have this little narrative of a guy who works in a storeroom at a WPA, like distribution center, where he's giving out goods to people on relief. You have someone else on the Civilian Conservation Corps crew, actually. So there was this aspect to the Federal Writers Project publications that was aware of what the New Deal was doing and was trying to portray it in a way that was sort of a little guarded and a little subdued, but was there. And they wanted to, I think, make the case that all this stuff was happening and it was totally fine. And it was something that people should welcome, which was kind of remarkable at a time when a lot of these measures were still quite new, obviously, but also quite controversial and in some cases pretty radical. But if you read the guidebooks, you'll get a sense that this isn't, that crazy at all. This seems totally fine that all this is happening. It seems totally normal, just like you'd be reading a guidebook that was collectively assembled by several hundred people working in the state on the government payroll. It all seemed like, the most rational thing to do. In a lot of ways it was, but that's how they portrayed their relationship with the rest of the WPA.
Thanks. Harry Hopkins figured out that writers have to eat just like normal people. What happened then? How did the whole thing get off the ground? And how did they figure out that guidebooks were going to be an emphasis to it? I mean, I've heard rumors, maybe it was Catherine Kellock's idea, maybe it was the poet Marianne Moore. There's a mysterious guy around Los Angeles named Hugh Harlan who went to Grinnell with a couple of them. What's the real story, or can it be even ascertained?
Sure. And I should mention too that, Hopkins obviously was this kind of pivotal figure in all this, along with other people in the administration and who worked with him at the WPA. But there's also a huge demand for a program like this coming from the ground up, from writers and from artists in other fields. And I didn't mention this before, but I feel like it's important to talk about, just as there is today. You have writers and cultural workers are kind of agitating for a new Federal Writers Project. That's exactly what happened in the 1930s. And that was a big reason for why they, I think, decided that something like this was feasible, that people wanted it, and that they could actually, take a chance on it and do it. So while that was all happening, there were a lot of different ideas about what this project could be doing. And the idea of guidebooks kept coming up. Like you mentioned, some of the people who kind of threw it out there. Catherine Kellock, who was working in the Resettlement Administration, another New Deal agency, was really interested in the Federal Writers Project. She knew Alsberg because her husband was his friend from college. They had this kind of, familiar relationship like that. So she was watching really closely, and she just thought guidebooks were the thing to do. It was relatively simple. It was something that seemed inoffensive and uncontroversial. And it would also mean that they could have a project set up in every state that could be working on these guidebooks. It would give them reason to do it. You wouldn't have a situation where most of the writers, writers who were alive in the 1930s were living in New York City, Chicago, other major urban areas, some in Los Angeles, not as many as today, but they were concentrated in these different centers. And so a lot of people who worked for some of the professional organizations like the Authors Guild, they thought the project should really be catering to them and should take on as many people as they could in the big cities and kind of don't worry about the rest of the country. But the Federal Writers Project, the people who were in charge, thought it was absolutely crucial to get that kind of coast to coast coverage and to really reach into all corners of the country, all these little rural communities, places that would have been overlooked otherwise. And creating guidebooks was the perfect solution. Like, that's what you can give someone a project to do. Go out and chart your own community, write about it, and contribute to the whole kind of like reawakening sense of America at that time by doing this. And so I think that's where the idea of the guidebooks came from. Everyone agreed, yeah, no one will have a problem with this. This will be great. And then, of course, once the book started coming out, there was this blowback against, it's not that they were necessarily wrong or not factual or something like that, but, matters of emphasis and omission and that sort of thing, which you can imagine was a huge issue for some of the books, but they tended to hold up to scrutiny and people loved them. People bought them. A few were bestsellers. They did pretty well. So the guidebook idea was a good one, I think, but it wasn't as uncontroversial as they had hoped it would be.
So if they'd picked somebody other than Henry Alsberg, how would the project have been different?
That's another good question. And, we can kind of tell because when Alsberg was fired in 1939, after the Dies Committee hearings, that turned into other committee hearings in Congress, then when they, really went after the project and tried to destroy it. So he was out and they hired someone in his place who was, I think was trying his best, but he didn't have that same kind of creative drive or vision for what the project should be doing. And the work, if you look at what they did then, there are a lot of things that had been in the pipeline, like guidebooks that hadn't come out. So that was a different issue, but they were focusing more on like bulletins and, for schools, just sort of like little boosterous publications that were kind of okay, but they had a little bit more of the Chamber of Commerce influence, which is something they would always mention, during the Alsberg years. Chamber of Commerce, we don't want them coming in and shaping all our publications and turning these into these kind of lifeless little advertisements for towns and communities. But that's what happened a little bit more after 1939, because you have this director who I think wasn't thinking about the kind of creative potential of something like the Federal Writers Project and was thinking about more just getting out content, as we would say today, and just keeping the project running, keeping the jobs going, which is really was its main purpose. But Alsberg really saw it as having this dual purpose, which is so crucial to how it actually played out.
And people were shocked, right? I mean, nobody had any great hopes for the project. And then all of a sudden they had a hit on their hands. That must have been an earthquake around the office.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what happened early on was that Vardis Fisher, who I mentioned before, is a novelist from Idaho. He was working on his guide. He didn't tell them at first, but he was actually writing the whole thing himself because he decided he couldn't rely on anyone in Idaho, which was really not a great thing to do with this kind of collective, project. He jettisoned that whole idea completely and just did all the tours on his own and wrote most of the guide. And he basically decided he was going to get it published himself first, while the Washington, D.C. office wanted, naturally, the Washington, D.C. guide to come out first because that made the most sense. So Vardis Fisher started sending in his drafts. Everything was almost ready to go. And they were really mad about how this all played out. And I kind of tell this story in the book. It's a great story. But when they read the writing, they thought, wow, this is actually spectacular. Like, this is, I think, I don't remember the exact quote, but either Alsberg or one of his editors said, you've raised the writing of travel guidebooks to the plane of permanent literature. So they were floored. And then when the book came out, it got hundreds of reviews everywhere that said the same thing. And prominent historians and cultural critics of the day would read these and thought, wow, like these are actually pretty good. Alfred Kazin, who wrote one of the kind of great summations of what the project contributed in a literary sense, he also was very impressed by these. So I think, people are expecting regular old travel guidebooks, like a AAA travel guide that'll tell you how to get from this place to this place. And they were really surprised when they got something much, much more interesting and imaginative than that.
I'm always fascinated. I used to work at the NEA as the director of literature, and literature somehow was always kind of a stepchild. It's like, the performing arts are the real arts, and literature, I don't know, is it a humanity instead? How did the Writers Project develop vis-a-vis the other three arts under Federal One, and how is it treated differently? Was it scapegoated more? Was it, did it get a pass where some of the others didn't? I wonder if you could just sort of distinguish it among its brethren in visual art and theater and music.
Sure. I think I kind of think that there is more of a difference between the art project or the art and music projects on the one hand, and then the writers project and the theater project on the other, which seems a little strange. But for the music project and the art project, they were basically, they didn't have the same kind of scope as a Federal Writers Project. They tended to hire people who were a little more, proven in their field. You couldn't put together a WPA orchestra with people who didn't really play an instrument but kind of could and wanted to learn or something. And the main point of these projects, I think, was to educate people and to expand sort of like recreational aspects of their medium. So you had, like concerts being set up all around the country in places that didn't usually get concerts. And that was true of the theater project too. It's hard to kind of differentiate it in this way. But what I'm getting at basically is that with the theater project and the writers project, you had them kind of dealing with aspects of American history and American life and also current affairs from the 1930s in this really direct way that pushed a lot of buttons for people. And I don't think you saw that as much in the other two projects, certainly not in the music project. In the art project to some extent, and that's still going on today with these murals in San Francisco that have been in the headlines the last couple of years, which is another issue. But some of that stuff could be controversial, what they were doing. But the theater project really was in the headlines for how it was interpreting, American culture and some big issues like, like power monopolies. That's one of the famous plays they put on. They did these living newspaper plays where they would kind of dramatize something that was in the news. And it was done from a particular perspective. It was something that was kind of in harmony with, I think, what people who were the architects of the New Deal would have thought about this. And so conservatives and other critics were really, really, kind of enraged by it. And the Writers Project was doing that in some ways too. If you look at some of the guides that have these essays on labor, and a lot of them, they're very supportive of the labor movement, the idea of like workers struggling for their rights over time, that how that's an important part of a state's history. And that also pushed a lot of buttons for some people too. And so you had the Writers Project and the Theater Project, I think, treading on this ground that the other two projects weren't necessarily treading on as much, just because of the way they were set up. But it was just different too with the Writers Project, because you had people who weren't necessarily, didn't really have any background in doing professional research or working in an office with other writers, working on publications and that sort of thing. They might have been, someone who worked in a real estate office and wrote copy for ads or something like that. So they had no experience working on anything like a guidebook or any kind of publication, but that's what they were kind of thrown into. So I think the Writers Project did have this kind of trial by fire aspect that the other three arts project didn't, even though they had their own obstacles to contend with, and it often got pretty hairy for them at a lot of points, especially the Theater Project too. But yeah, it had a slightly different nature to it.
Tell us a little more about how the project played out on the ground in the States. I mean, for example, were Martin Dye's constituents back home, shouting, yeah, stick it to those writers? Or was the equation a little bit different when you had people maybe not in large population centers being asked questions, being listened to by representatives of their government, maybe by out-of-work reporters for the local paper? What was it like, sort of face-to-face on a personal level as they researched and wrote these guides?
Yeah, that was the thing. So you had people going out into their own communities for the most part, talking to, in a lot of cases, people they'd known their entire lives, their neighbors and coworkers, just kind of get a sense of what their lives were like, what they did, what they knew about the area, especially what older residents remembered from, the recent past. And by taking that all down and showing this kind of interest, they generated a lot of goodwill for the project. It wasn't always the case. Some people were hostile to it for sure. But I think for the most part, people at the grassroots level sort of welcomed this. And there's a great story about Vardis Fisher, to go back to him again. When he was kind of plotting to get his Idaho guide published, he went to a local printer he knew, Caxton Printers in Idaho, who'd published some of his other books. And the guy who ran Caxton Printers, he's actually in the photo with Fisher. If you were to go back and look at the slideshow, he was in that photo too, because they were pretty close friends. But he was a pretty conservative guy. He hated Roosevelt and the New Deal. He didn't like the overall scope of what the government was doing. But when he heard about the Federal Writers Project, he thought, you know what, this is great, because this is giving us an opportunity to write about our state, to tell people about our communities and how we live, and to tell our stories that had never really been told before as part of this, unprecedented federal effort to capture these stories and to create these publications. So he was 100% for it, and he thought it was great. He was really eager to put out the Idaho guidebook, and he did, and he put out the Idaho lore book too. And I think that kind of attitude was happening all over across the country, where people might have been looking a little askew at certain things the Roosevelt administration was doing, certain aspects of the New Deal that maybe they didn't like. But if a federal writer came around and was talking about how their great aunt had some great story about the road she grew up on and the ghost that lived down the street or something like that, like, they would tell people about it, and they wanted to see their stories told. So that absolutely was an aspect of it that I think no one was necessarily counting on in terms of the national office in Washington. I don't think they knew what they were in for when they were doing this, but it actually worked pretty well. And you go out and listen to people, that's all what a lot of people want.
One of the things I love most about your book is the way it's structured. I mean, 40 years ago, there was a pretty damn good book about the WPA. I think the only major sort of publishing house out of New York book about the WPA called The Dream and the Deal, which tries to get its arms around the entirety of the project semi-chronologically. You find a way by focusing on 5 people to tell the whole story of the project, or at least give people a good representative handle on it, and also to progress roughly chronologically, but bring in a bunch of supporting characters. Really cunningly developed. I wonder if you talk about how you hit on that structure, and also it must have been agony deciding which 5 or 6 you were going to keep and who gets thrown overboard. I wonder if there might be a sort of unsung character, somebody that, even people who, follow literature fairly closely might not have heard of and really deserves further study. So multi-part question, but jump in anywhere.
Sure. So yeah, when I was kind of coming up with the idea for the book, there have been that great Jerry Mangione book is fantastic, but he does kind of jump around all over the place. He worked for the project, so some of it is his own recollections, and he tried to get it all in there. And I thought, there's another way to tell this story by just focusing on a couple of people, not only because it just gives it, some narrative cohesion a little bit, but by doing that, you can kind of show the journeys that these different people took to the project and what they brought with them. Because I think what was so remarkable about the Federal Writers Project is that it kind of like put these roots out into the literary landscape of the 1930s and then drew up all these different influences from different places and through different people. So you have like 2 of the people I talk about in the book are Zora Neale Hurston and Richard Wright. They're 2 of the great, 2 of the great writers in American history, I would say. Certainly 2 of the most notable Black writers of the 20th century, and that they had these kind of diametrically opposing views about how race and literature should intersect. And they famously, reviewed each other's books in this kind of really nasty way in some cases. It's kind of unfortunate because I think they were perfect complements to each other, but they saw their 2 missions as being totally opposed in an aesthetic sense, in a cultural sense, and politically too. They're very much at odds and politically. But they both worked for the Federal Writers Project, and they both made these great contributions to it. And many other writers who were, in similar situations as they are, who had very different ideas about how writing should work in the 1930s and, like what they could bring to something like the Federal Writers Project, they were all part of the same thing. So you had this really diverse group of people who were shaping the project, like kind of determining like its different aims, its different impulses, and giving it this kind of character that reflected what was going on in the 30s, which I think people hadn't really thought about before, or at least like looked at too closely, other than just calling this great novelty of a thing that happened in the Depression. It really was that expression of the entire 30s cultural moment. So anyway, that's a long way of saying that I focus on these particular people because they gave me a glimpse into the different aspects of that. And they also allowed me to look at different, geographical places where the project was operating. Like Henry Alsberg obviously was in Washington, D.C., even though he was kind of jumping all over the place. But his base was in Washington. His story kind of tells you how the project got set up. Vardis Fisher was, an established writer who was in the West. He was like these other writers who were far from the metropolitan centers, but who needed this work and who, in his case, ran the project. You had a lot of other great writers who ran their own projects, or people who weren't necessarily well known as writers, but who were the directors in their own states, who have these pretty interesting stories and sometimes had these fraught relationships with the federal office in DC. Nelson Algren in Chicago, he was someone who he published one novel right before the Federal Writers Project was created, didn't do that well, and he was completely despondent. He thought he'd failed as a writer completely. He tried to commit suicide, actually, that he got on the project, and it saved his life, like literally saved his life. And it put him on this path toward becoming, again, one of the great writers of the 20th century. Zora Neale Hurston we talked about already, and Richard Wright, same kind of thing, but in very different ways. And then Hurston, you have experienced in the project in a very different way than Wright, because she was working in Florida, which of course is a segregated state. So she was not in the office in Jacksonville with the rest of the main staff, because that was the white office. She went there sometimes to visit, but she was mostly actually working out of her home. There was a separate Black office, in a different part of town that was formally segregated from the rest. And this was the case in other, projects in the South. It was something that affected the entire scope of the New Deal. So her experience kind of gives us a window into that compromise that was built into the whole structure of the WPA and the New Deal in general. And then Dies, I talk about him, Martin Dies, a little bit to show you this kind of backlash to the project and why so many people, maybe I shouldn't say so many, but why certain people kind of ended up targeting the project for destruction and why they thought it was a threat to their ideas about American identity and American culture, and why they set out to dismantle it. So that's kind of how I landed on these different people. They all had some kind of way to contribute to the scope of the story.
Okay, so don't hold out on me. I have a classroom full of students every quarter who try to find obscure FWP figures and champion. Who's your pick for a dark horse?
Oh man, that's a good question. You know, there's a guy, Jack Balch, who worked in Missouri, and I have his book somewhere back there. Jack Conroy is one of the better known, lesser known writers, I should say, who worked for the Federal Writers Project. He was this great kind of proletarian novelist. He was sort of a mentor to Nelson Algren, and he started out in the Missouri Project and then eventually came to Chicago too. When he was in Missouri, there was another guy working there who had written for his magazine called The Anvil, which is this kind of, another great example of the 30s proletarian radical literary culture. And Balch this other guy was working in the office. He was kind of a deputy editor there working with Conroy. The whole story of the Missouri office was an absolute disaster. They went on strike at one point. The woman who ran it was a, creature of this local political machine who was very inefficient. The whole thing was kind of corrupt. Basically, the whole project ended up imploding. And then Allsburg sent in a few people from Washington as a kind of flying squadron of editors to come in and just create a little skeleton crew on the project staff and then put out a new guidebook. So that's what they did. But out of that wreckage, this guy, Jack Balch, went home and decided to write a novel. So he wrote this novel called Lamps at High Noon about his experience on the project. And he's in it, Jack Conroy is in it as a kind of fictionalized version of himself. And when I was first, doing my research, I had heard about this and then I got a copy of the novel. It's been reissued. I don't have it on at hand, but you should look it up. It's out there, it's available to get. And I kind of thought this was one of those things I have to read because, I need to read all this stuff and it's going to be terrible. And I read it and I thought it was great. It was this fantastic novel. It was pretty funny. It was kind of moving in a lot of places. And it wasn't just of interest because it gave you a little glimpse of what the Federal Writers Project was like. It was just a good novel. So I'll hold him up as a great, discovery of that time. There's another novel, I'm forgetting the name, of someone in the New York City Project wrote that kind of touched on his own time working on the project, and it was terrible. It was pretty much what I was expecting, this really self-indulgent, this is very cruel, but kind of rightfully forgotten novel. I wasn't very impressed, but the other one, Lamps at High Noon, is absolutely worth reading.
Okay, we're going to open it up to the audience in a second, but I have a last question, which I have to ask. How did you know several years ago when you started this project about the Federal Writers Project that it was going to land right now when the country was in arguably its darkest hour since the Depression? And what are your hopes and fears for what a new writers project, even if it passes Congress? And of course, I should say, to everybody within the sound of my voice, for heaven's sake, please write to or even call and leave a message with your congressman, especially if he's on the House Education and Labor Committee, because between now and quite possibly September 13th, the new project, House Resolution 3054, the 21st Century Federal Writers Project, is on the line. So Scott, like I said, what are your hopes for it? What do you worry about? You must have given this some thought.
Yeah, it's funny because I inherited this collection of guidebooks, the one back here. I think it was in 2005. So when my great uncle died, and these books were floating around. My parents got them, and they said, you would like these. Why don't you hang on to them? They're kind of interesting. So I had them sitting around. I was in college at the time. In 2008, I was graduating from college, and I looked through some of the books. I did really think they were pretty fascinating. I didn't know that much about the Federal Writers Project, but they were always kind of hanging around in the back of my mind. Then, of course, 2007, 2008, you had the financial collapse, the Great Recession happened. And when Obama came into office, a lot of people were talking about a New Deal then. That was kind of the thing in the news for a little bit. And people had a lot of, myself included, had these high hopes for what could happen. And, I was thinking even at that time, these books probably tell us something about the New Deal back then that could be useful for what's happening now during this potential New Deal. And, isn't this interesting? It didn't get very much past that kind of, inchoate state of me just musing about this stuff. But of course, that moment sort of passed, sadly, and we didn't have a New Deal back then. And the books just stayed in the back of my mind. And when I decided finally some years later to actually start looking into the story, to do my own research and to potentially put together this book, it seemed like a very long way away from, any sense of, seeing a revival of anything like the New Deal, even a modest version of it. That was actually right around the time that Trump was elected. And I remember for me, it was like, what do these books have to say to us in Donald Trump's America? Because they give you this portrait of, the United States that's very inclusive and diverse and, is participatory. That's really, I think, what the guides imply through their very structure, is that you should be going out and experiencing the United States and discovering it and participating in learning about it and telling its story and that sort of thing. It's like a vision of citizenship that I think was very much under attack during the Trump administration. So yeah, I definitely didn't think that there was anything in store like what's happening now, where we have this real movement to recreate the Federal Writers Project and other aspects of the New Deal, not just out of necessity, because they are, of a huge necessity right now because of the pandemic and because of even longer trends that have been affecting the arts field and the culture industry, and just, inequality in general for all Americans, but because they are such kind of like resounding models that we can look to for this creative way to, combine the state's power with, creative energies of the American people, and to do something innovative and imaginative, in some ways that had been done before through the Federal Writers Project, but in some ways that are entirely new, that are up to us to kind of shape. So I think that's really astounding. I had no idea that this would be the case when I was working on the book, or even when I was, wrapping up my last draft, which wasn't that long ago, but it feels like a very long time ago. So yeah, it's really, the timing was something else.
I see that someone named Ginny Lupi has done us a great service by linking to the bill, which I encourage you all to go and check out. Shall I hand it off to Susan now, who's going to moderate what looks like quite a few good questions?
Thanks, you two. It was a really interesting conversation. Good questions, amazing answers. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There's some questions around the American guides. There's a lot of interest in the controversy around those guides. And then there's also some questions about the 21st century Federal Writers Project legislation. So I guess these are for both of you. One question is about the Jim Crow era and segregation, and how did the guidebooks navigate political and social pitfalls like that? Were they able to present state histories in a way that were inclusive and unified, or how did Jim Crow affect that?
Yeah, I mean, David, if you want to chime in on any of this stuff, I know you're a guidebook expert as well, so if you want to add anything, feel free, but I can say for sure, I mean, that was something that sort of roiled the staff of the Federal Writers Project at the time. They knew that they had to address, they wanted to have this national reach and to have every state obviously be involved in the writing of their own guidebooks and to do this other work that the project was doing. But that meant, working with a lot of people who were white supremacists, basically, and who were operating in this kind of Jim Crow structure. And the project I didn't think that they felt like they could take it head on necessarily, even though some people like Alsberg and others in the office might have wanted to, or their sympathies lied in that direction. So when you look at the guidebooks today, you can see this rift is kind of present in them. For instance, the thing that I always bring up kind of gives it away. If you read guidebooks from the northern states, they talk about the Civil War. If you read guidebooks from certain southern states, they talk about the war between the states. And there's actually a letter from the Daughters of the Confederacy, I think, someone there writing to Alsberg, sort of threatening him and saying that, you have to use this term, war between the states. And if you don't, it's going to be very bad for the project. She didn't say how, but, the implication was that they would cause a huge stink about it. So just that little choice of language, tells you a lot. And it tells you a lot, too, that Alsberg allowed it. He wasn't really going to, put his foot down about certain things. They did have this remarkable guy, Sterling Brown, who worked in the project in the national office. He was a Black poet and critic who taught at Howard University. He was pretty young. He was in his mid-30s, I think. And they appointed him to be, his official title was Negro Affairs Editor. And so he was kind of like the person who read all the guidebooks, all the different publications, with an eye toward making sure they were inclusive and they weren't, full of, kind of like casually racist language or these terrible omissions. And he's reading some guidebook copy that left out Fisk University was one example he had. And he was completely astounded. Like, how could you leave that out? So he had a really tough job, and there were a few other people working with him. But he'd go over all this stuff. He'd make suggestions about how they should change it. He would write new material for them to use. And in some cases, his suggestions were heard. In some other cases, they were completely ignored by some of the Southern state director. So he was always waging this constant battle. So that's a long version of the answer, is that, it was a battle, and it was something that different people on the project were waging from different perspectives, from different positions, I would say. But you had the project doing a lot of really remarkable things in terms of supporting Black writers and other artistic people, mostly in the North, but someone like Zerenia Hurston in the South, she had this job, she was contributing great things to the guide, but she was qualified to be the director of the project. And she wasn't, obviously. She was one of the lowest ranking people there. And it's really sad that people like that weren't really, the project couldn't use them to their full potential and allow them to, reach their full potential on the project because of Jim Crow. So it's something that, I wouldn't say it tarnishes the legacy of the whole project, but it's absolutely present in the legacy of the project. And it's something that we still have to reckon with today.
David, did you want to add something, or shall I go ahead?
I cherish how many interracial friendships were formed on the project. Algren and Richard Wright, Saul Bellow and Ralph Ellison. I think those are instructive for us now.
Yeah. On the other hand, was there pressure on the FWP to include conservatives' stories or conservatives' perspectives? We know a lot more kind of about the amplification of how leftist it was, but I'm wondering if the conservatives managed to get their side in as well.
Well, I think in the sense of interviewing people in a community, say, and telling their stories and that sort of thing, they didn't really differentiate. Like, they weren't only going after people who had politics that were sympathetic to the New Deal or who were radical or something like that. They would talk to anyone, and anything that got into the guidebooks, was fair game. So in that sense, in terms of telling stories, I think they were pretty inclusive, and they made an effort to really, give you a sense of the diversity of a different area and different people who lived there and that sort of thing. But as the project went on, you did have people who were working in the national office who were basically censors, who were looking at some of the, the manuscripts to make sure that nothing slipped in that could be considered too radical and that could get the project in trouble. And some of these people, two of them in particular, ended up testifying in front of the Dies Committee as hostile witnesses. And some of the stuff that they talked about is just absolutely absurd. Like, they would say, there was some bad stuff about Henry Ford in one guide, but I don't remember what it is. Or there's something about how, this is one of the most remarkable lines, how, Black people are oppressed and that sort of thing, and are beaten down, and, they don't have any rights or something like. And they consider that communist propaganda, but it was an actual fact about what life was like for Black people in the 1930s. So from their perspective, things that were getting into the guide that were, quote unquote radical, weren't really radical at all. They were totally rational ways of describing social reality at the time. But that was their job, to try to, pare those things back so that there wouldn't be too much negative attention from conservative critics. Because what actually happened with the Massachusetts guidebook, there was a huge blowback against that, because it included, and this was true, it actually included a little more about the Sacco and Vanzetti case, the two anarchists who were executed by the state only, not that long before the guide was being written. They included more material on that than they did about the Boston Tea Party and some other kind of pillars of Massachusetts history. So people were in uproar about that. And later on, the project quietly edited the guide, changed some of the wording, changed some of the stuff in the labor essay, even though they kind of claimed that they didn't. But there's a great book about the Massachusetts project by a scholar named Christine Bold that gets into this whole story, and she kind of looked at the manuscripts and figured it out a little bit. So you can see that, the project wasn't necessarily, I think people like Osberg and some others, I should say, were not backing down from their vision of how the book should be and what the project should do, but they were also kind of pragmatic in the sense that they didn't want to attract too much attention if they could avoid it from people who were really out to destroy the project for these ideological reasons.
There's a question from someone I know who does a lot of research, and he's saying that it's frustratingly little info in the American guides about the amount of public works that the New Deal performed. And he's wondering why the Federal Writers Project didn't tout the WPA when it was on the ropes.
Yeah, I think that was something, we talked about a little bit at the very beginning, that I think they were worried about coming across as a kind of, propaganda arm for the WPA and the Roosevelt administration. So they played down the material about what was happening. Like, it wasn't necessarily supposed to be a record of, all the WPA projects. It wasn't like your guide to what the WPA was doing in a particular state, but it was woven in there for sure. But I think they made an effort to let that sit in the background a little bit. And yeah, I mean, you had this situation where when the WPA was on the ropes, workers in the different Federal Writers Project offices were going on strike. Like in New York City, they went on a hunger strike. They shut down, their office. People on the other arts projects there kidnapped one of the administrators. It was this whole, thing. It was really kind of remarkable. So they were defending the WPA for sure. In a lot of cases, they were doing it in the streets through protests and through strikes and that sort of thing. The administrators, I think, were a little more worried about, getting people angry who were above them, because in some cases you had, the WPA itself was calling for these cutbacks because they were constantly changing the roles and that sort of thing. So I think the top people at the Federal Writers Project were caught in between their own workers, which are tended to be more militant about defending the WPA and trying to expand it, and some of the other people in the administration, and of course the critics outside the administration, who are constantly trying to shrink it. So people like Alsberg and some of the other top administrators kind of had this unenviable position. But I do think they could have done more, but that's today.
I'd like to ask a couple of questions that we have about the 21st Century Federal Writers Project. Perhaps, David, you could tell us a little bit about how that's come about. How you see what you see the Federal Writers Project doing, and what they might be writing about.
Well, I encourage people to Google it up, because I've probably gone on too long in print about how the whole thing came together, but I'm thrilled in the last couple of minutes to talk at least a little bit about how I would envision such a thing, beyond just wanting everybody to, chime in and share their own hopes for the project. If I had my druthers, it would sort of start on two tracks. On the one hand, reflecting the way the bill has only logically and sensibly been written, it would be an account of the country and what it suffered and how it's recovering from the pandemic. We wouldn't be having this conversation without the pandemic. But on the other hand, my wish would be there would be a second track, which would be much truer to the vision for the original Writers Project. So you've got the sort of rapid response crisis team on the one hand, concentrating on the pandemic. And on the other hand, you've got something much more ambitious, trying to tell the story of American places and lives. And who knows, maybe if the project is renewed, because it's written in such a way that it would be up for renewal after a year, maybe the second project, the more ambitious project, keeps going. And the first project, which is focused on the pandemic, if God willing, the pandemic is in the rearview window by then, maybe it picks a different focus for that year. And so every year you get, the ongoing wonderful guides and oral histories that we cherish the original project for, while at the same time you've got this other hemisphere that's looking at, if not the pandemic, then next year maybe climate change, because of course that's a great way to tell the story of climate change, not just scientists from New York and California, but farmers, how they're experiencing it firsthand. So there could be a theme every year, but at the same time ongoing there would be the FWP that we all know and love and can't stop wanting to learn more about.
So do you see writers coming up with their own ideas or what they wanted to work on, or would these ideas be handed down from on high?
Well, I mean, as a writer myself, I know how risky giving a writer his head can be. I think I would, the bill is written somewhat differently. The government wouldn't be employing these writers directly. People would apply to the government from grants, whether these are nonprofits or learning institutions or unions or libraries, or even maybe a state could come in, and that would reflect the original project a bit more. I prefer a project that's a little bit more directed from a nucleus, just because the example of the original project with Alsberg and his not always merry band is so inspiring to me. But as long as you've got writers out there, indulging their own ingenuity while at the same time somebody is whispering in their ear, if they don't have that voice in the head saying, in their own heads saying, this is for the country. Country's flat on its back. We need somebody to tell its stories, somebody to reassure it that those stories are worth listening to. So it's got to satisfy a lot of different masters and expectations, but so did the original, and we're still talking about it. And everybody who learns about it from great books like Scott's, of which there are, to my mind, none or few, shares those hopes.
So I know we're running close on time here, but given today's polarized political climate, can you imagine something like climate change being a topic, or the pandemic even being a topic that would be sanctioned by whoever heads up this new Federal Writers Project?
There will inevitably be a lot of hue and cry, just like there was for the original project. And, focusing on the pandemic, though it doesn't seem like it would necessarily be a divisive issue, look at the news and you might discover otherwise. Certainly climate change, even if you would be hearing about it from, farmers as well as meteorologists, could be a divisive subject. But at the same time, I've been working on this for 15 months, and I get this question. I understand this question. How do you handle a political football? How do you appease one side versus the other? And as I look at the guides, as I think about particular legislators that I would love to win over, and so I dip into some of these unsung guides. I dip into Arkansas, which did not have John Cheever in the office, did not have Richard Wright in the office. I look at Virginia, which did a great oral history project, but nobody holds up the guides like they hold up California or Chicago. Nobody holds up California, but they should. First of all, you're astonished by how good they are. You're kind of humbled at how talented, by no means all, but some of these writers must have been in every state to come out with paragraphs and entries this good. But also, you realize just how political the world is not a lot of the time. 95% of the stuff in these guides has, to my eye, no political dimension whatsoever. Is a story about fishing with dynamite in Arkansas Republican leaning or Democratic leaning? No, it's just interesting. And so, yeah, these controversies presumably will not abate. I hope they're not, deleterious to the project. I hope they don't strangle it in its cradle, because like I said, a lot's going to happen between now and September 13th, which is why I'll, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to implore you again to contact your elected representatives. But, just think for a minute how multifarious and fascinating this country is in ways that have no political dimension whatsoever.
I'm going to give you the chance for the last word, but I also want to point out that Republic of Detours can be purchased at Chevalier's Books in LA, which is a long-standing independent bookstore. It's been around since the New Deal. So if you're interested in buying this book, check out Chevalier's online. Any last words before I thank you?
Scott?
I just wanted to say, just to echo what David was saying about, the original project and the potential for a new one, is that when you look at what the original Federal Writers Project did, yeah, there are instances where this paragraph was slanted toward this way, or, that people argued about back then, that sort of thing. But what was really so remarkable, that was something that you could say is not political, or you could say is political in an entirely different way, is that it took thousands and thousands of people and kind of mobilize them to go out and create this self-portrait of America, and from a grassroots level. You know, it made them the protagonists of this story and said, you go out there, tell us what you see, write about it. We'll all put it together. We'll work on it together, and we'll kind of assemble this portrait of the country out of all these little pieces, just whatever's out there. And the process by which they did that was part of that story too. And so what I think a new Federal Writers Project would do today is kind of replicate that, which is itself kind of a political act, but it's not political in the way that I think people are being increasingly conditioned to think of as political today, with like, you know, you have this set of talking points or that set of talking points or these different things on social media you read or whatever. I think it's profoundly political, but in the best, most democratic sense. And it's something that I think a lot of people would really, you know, be eager to participate in and to see come to fruition if they gave it a chance. Because that kind of, you know, it's like, what else are we talking about when we're talking about the story of America and, you know, the qualities of American identity and the meaning of citizenship and that sort of thing. But that kind of going out and engaging with other people and participating in this thing. So starting from that as a starting point, I think, is really the key. And that's what the Federal Writers Project did. And that's what a new project could do too. And it could, I'm being very optimistic here, but it could kind of change the conversation in this country, I think, in a major way, if it was allowed to go forward.
And God bless Barbara Sweet in the audience for asking for the bill number again. That's something that any congressman's office or congresswoman's office is going to want to know. It's 3054. If anybody's got a mnemonic device for it, I'd love to have one handy. And if anybody wants to contact me, because I have, you know, some pointers, if you'd like them, of, you know, tactics that have worked, stuff that, you know, you certainly wouldn't want to leave out in any letter, though there's no wrong way to do this, just different right ones. And to which I would only add that some of the factors we've been hearing about in the last few minutes that might complicate the passage of and the implementation, we hope, of a new Federal Writers Project, the political divisions in the country, are exactly the kinds of reasons why we need this project so desperately. Ultimately, I think of it as a listening project as well as a writing project, and an opportunity to introduce America to itself again. Root for it, help it, join it when the time comes.
Thank you both so much. And thank you everyone who tuned in. And thank you for your support of the Living New Deal. We look forward to seeing you back again for future webinars. Stay tuned.
I'm putting my email address in the chat room, so don't destroy it right away. Maybe it's even preservable for all the wonderful other comments that people have been making.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Susan, and thank you, the Living New Deal, and Gray Brecken for thinking it up.
Thanks, everyone.